The restaurant fell silent except for the sound of cruel laughter. Margaret stood frozen beside the table, her weathered hands clutching a worn cloth purse against her chest. The floral dress she wore, faded, patched at the hem, clearly from another decade, hung loosely on her thin frame. 3 women in their 30s, dressed in sleek athleisure and designer handbags, were taking photos of her with their phones. "Oh my God, did you see that dress?" the blonde one said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Is this a costume party nobody told us about?" Margaret's face flushed deep red. Her lips trembled as she tried to move past them toward the restroom, but one of the women shifted her chair deliberately, blocking the narrow path between tables. "Excuse me," Margaret said softly, her voice barely audible. "What's that?" The brunette cupped her ear mockingly. "Sorry, I don't speak vintage." The third woman, recording everything on her phone, added, "This is going on TikTok. Poverty chic. My followers are going to die." But let's go back to where this really started, to understand why Margaret was here at all. 6 hours earlier, Margaret had stood in front of her bathroom mirror in the small apartment she'd lived in for 43 years. At 72, she looked every day of her age, and then some. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis, shook slightly as she fastened the buttons on the floral dress, the same one she'd worn to her daughter's college graduation 30 years ago. It was the nicest thing she owned. Today was special. Today, for the first time in 5 years, she was meeting her daughter Rachel for lunch. Rachel, who'd moved to California for work and whose visits had grown increasingly rare. Rachel, who'd called last week with excitement in her voice. "Mom, I'm coming to town for a conference. Let's do lunch at the Garden House. You'll love it." Margaret had looked up the Garden House online and nearly fainted at the prices. $28 for a salad, $35 for a sandwich. But Rachel had insisted on treating, and Margaret hadn't seen her daughter in so long that she would have agreed to lunch on the moon. She'd taken the bus across town, arriving 15 minutes early because that's what her generation did. The hostess had looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain before checking the reservation. "Klein party? Your daughter called ahead. She's running late. Traffic." The hostess's tone suggested she didn't believe someone like Margaret could have a daughter who ate at places like this. "You can wait at the bar." Margaret had never been to a bar in her life. She'd waited near the entrance instead, standing because the elegant chairs looked too pristine for her to touch in her old dress. When Rachel finally texted, "So sorry, Mom. Meeting running over. Maybe 20 more men. Go ahead and get a table. Order whatever you want." Margaret had forced herself to approach the hostess again. The hostess had seated her at a small table near the back, close to the restrooms. Close to where 3 women were already deep into their second bottle of wine and their first round of grievances about their personal trainers, their housekeepers, their husband's inability to understand that Pilates wasn't just exercise, it was self-care. Margaret had tried to make herself invisible, studying the menu with growing anxiety. Even the soup was $18. She'd wait for Rachel. She'd just sit quietly and wait. But then she'd needed the restroom. Her bladder wasn't what it used to be, and the bus ride had been long. She'd stood carefully, smoothing down her dress, and tried to navigate the narrow space between tables. That's when it started. "Oh, my God," the blonde, whose name was Tiffany, though Margaret didn't know that, had looked up from her phone with theatrical horror. "Is that woman homeless? Should we call someone?" Her friend Jessica had laughed, wine loose and mean. "Look at that dress. My grandmother wouldn't be caught dead in that, and she's literally dead." The third woman, Melissa, had immediately started filming. "This is perfect. When you accidentally wander into a nice restaurant. The contrast is amazing." Margaret had frozen, hoping they weren't talking about her. But they were looking right at her. "Excuse me," she'd whispered, trying to pass. That's when Tiffany moved her chair, blocking her path. When Jessica had made that crack about speaking vintage. When Melissa had announced her plans to make Margaret into content for strangers to mock. Now, standing trapped between their table and the wall, Margaret felt tears burning her eyes. Her hands trembled so badly her purse nearly slipped from her grip. "Please," she said. "I just need to." "Need to what? Find a soup kitchen?" Jessica dissolved into giggles. "Honey, this place has a dress code. You're bringing down the whole aesthetic." Other diners were starting to notice. Some looked away uncomfortably. Others watched with the guilty fascination of people grateful not to be the target. A few pulled out their own phones. Margaret's vision blurred. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, to be anywhere but here, being photographed and laughed at like an exhibit in a museum of poverty. She didn't notice the man at the table directly beside theirs, the one in the crisp suit who'd been working on his laptop, carefully close his computer and stand up. The man who stood was in his early 50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of tailored charcoal suit that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. His movements were controlled, precise, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He stepped directly between Margaret and the three women, his body language protective without being aggressive. "Excuse me, ladies." His voice was calm, almost pleasant. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." Tiffany looked up, her expression shifting instantly from mockery to flirtation. She'd clocked the Rolex, the custom suit, the polished Italian shoes. "Oh, hi. We're just having a little fun." "That's not what I saw." He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen deliberately. "What I saw was three women harassing an elderly person trying to use the restroom. I recorded the last 90 seconds. Clear audio. All three of your faces. Would you like me to send it to your employers, or would you prefer I post it publicly first?" Jessica's face drained of color. "You can't. That's illegal. It's a public space. One-party consent state. I'm the party, and I consent." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm also the CEO of Meridian Consulting Group. We work with most of the major corporations in this city. I'm very curious to know where you ladies work." Melissa had stopped recording, her phone lowered. "This is ridiculous. We were just joking around." "Joking?" The man repeated the word like he was examining it for defects. "Tell me, what's the punchline? That someone is elderly? That she's not wealthy? That she's wearing a dress that's out of style?" He paused. "Actually, that dress is vintage Gun Sachs late 70s, early 80s. Worth quite a bit to collectors if it's in good condition. Which tells me the woman wearing it has taken excellent care of her belongings for decades." He turned to Margaret, and his entire demeanor softened. "Ma'am, I apologize on behalf of these women. Would you like me to call the manager and have them removed?" "You have every right." Margaret shook her head quickly, tears spilling down her weathered cheeks. "I just want to go to the bathroom," she whispered. "My daughter is meeting me, and I wanted everything to be nice." The man's jaw tightened. He turned back to the three women, and now his voice carried an edge that made people at nearby tables go quiet. "Move your chairs now." Tiffany scrambled to pull her chair back. The pathway cleared instantly. "Thank you," Margaret breathed, and hurried toward the restroom with as much dignity as she could gather, her old purse clutched against her chest like armor. The moment she disappeared, the man addressed the three women in a voice that cut through the restaurant's ambient noise. "Delete those photos. All of them. Now. You can't make us. I can't. But I can identify you. I can find out where you work. I can make sure this video reaches your bosses, your families, everyone you know." He held up his phone. "I've already shared it to cloud storage. 3 copies. So even if you somehow got this phone, the evidence exists." Jessica's hands shook as she opened her phone and started deleting. Melissa and Tiffany followed suit, their earlier confidence evaporated. "Let me see," he said, and each woman had to show him their recently deleted folders, which they then had to empty while he watched. The manager appeared, drawn by the commotion, a thin man in his 40s with the practiced smile of someone used to managing difficult situations. "Mr. Morrison, is everything all right? I didn't realize you were dining with us today, David," Morrison said, because of course he knew the manager personally. These three women were harassing an elderly customer, blocking her path, photographing her, mocking her appearance. "I want them removed." David's smile vanished. "Police, and let Mr. Morrison show them his video." The three women gathered their designer bags and left without another word, their faces burning with humiliation. Every diner in the restaurant watched them go. Morrison returned to his table and sat down, but he positioned himself so he could see the restroom door. He didn't touch his laptop. He waited. When Margaret emerged 10 minutes later, her face washed and her composure somewhat restored, Morrison stood again. "Ma'am, would you join me for a moment?" Margaret hesitated, but something in his face, genuine kindness, maybe, or the exhaustion of his anger on her behalf, made her approach his table. "Please sit," he said, pulling out a chair. Margaret perched on the edge, uncomfortable with the attention. You didn't have to do that. Make a fuss. Yes, I did. Morrison's voice was gentle now. May I ask your name? Margaret Klein. Mrs. Klein, I'm James Morrison. I want to apologize that you experienced that. You deserved better. He paused. You said your daughter is meeting you? Margaret nodded, fresh tears threatening. She's late. She's so busy now, so successful. I didn't want her to see me upset. I wanted to be the mother she remembers. Strong. Put together. She looked down at her dress. I know this is old. I know I don't belong here. But I wanted. You belong anywhere you want to be, Morrison said firmly. Morrison signaled the waiter and ordered tea for Margaret. Something calming. Please, chamomile if you have it, before settling back in his chair. Margaret's hands still trembled slightly as she clutched her purse. Mrs. Klein, Morrison said carefully, may I tell you why I reacted so strongly back there? Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. My mother raised me alone. She worked 3 jobs, cleaned offices at night, did alterations during the day, took in ironing on weekends. I wore secondhand clothes until I was in college. She wore the same church dress for 15 years. His eyes grew distant. When I was in business school, I took her to a nice restaurant for Mother's Day. I'd saved up for months. And a group of women, not unlike those 3, made comments. Loud enough for her to hear. About her shoes. Her outdated purse. He paused, jaw working. My mother didn't say anything. Just smiled and told me the food was delicious. But I saw her face. I saw her trying not to cry. And I swore that if I ever had the power to stop that from happening to someone else, I would use it. Margaret's eyes filled. What happened to your mother? She passed away 6 years ago. Heart attack. She never got to see me really make something of myself. Never got to stop working. His voice roughened. I'd give every dollar I've ever made to take her to lunch one more time. To see her without worrying about bills or bus schedules or what people thought of her clothes. A sob escaped Margaret before she could stop it. I'm so sorry. So am I. Morrison cleared his throat, composing himself. Which is why I want you to know, that dress is beautiful. It's beautifully maintained, it's vintage, and anyone with actual class would recognize that you've taken care of it with love. The women who mocked you? They'll throw their designer clothes away next season when the trends change. But you've held on to something meaningful for decades. That's worth more than anything in their closets. The waiter brought tea and fresh bread without being asked. Morrison must have signaled him. Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting the heat seep into her arthritic joints. Your daughter, Morrison said gently. Tell me about her. Margaret's face transformed. Rachel. She's brilliant. Software engineer. She works for a big tech company in San Francisco. She's speaking at some conference here in town. I'm so proud of her I could burst. She's lucky to have you. I'm lucky she makes time for me at all. I know I embarrass her sometimes. I'm not. I don't understand computers or her job or why people pay $7 for coffee. Margaret's smile was sad. I still clip coupons. Still save aluminum foil to reuse. She tries to hide it when her friends are around. How I am. Old-fashioned. Out of touch. Morrison leaned forward. Mrs. Klein, can I tell you what I see? I see a woman who raised a daughter successful enough to speak at conferences. I see someone who values things enough to care for them properly. I see strength and dignity and grace. He paused. And I see someone who deserves to enjoy lunch with her daughter without being made to feel small. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a cloth napkin, so much nicer than paper, and took a shaky sip of tea. The restaurant's front door opened, and a woman in her early 40s rushed in, slightly disheveled from running, her laptop bag bouncing against her hip. She scanned the room anxiously, and her face lit up when she spotted Margaret. Mom. Rachel hurried over, then stopped short when she saw Morrison. Oh, I'm sorry, am I interrupting? Margaret stood, and Morrison stood with her. Rachel, this is Mr. Morrison. He was very kind to me. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly, protective instinct flaring. Is everything okay? Morrison extended his hand. Everything's fine now. Your mother handled an unpleasant situation with remarkable grace. You should be very proud of her. He turned to Margaret and pulled out his wallet, extracting a business card. Mrs. Klein, this has my direct email. If you ever need anything, a reference, help with something, anything at all, you contact me. I mean that. Margaret took the card with shaking hands. Thank you. I don't know what to say. Say you'll enjoy lunch with your daughter. Morrison smiled. David. He called the manager over. Mrs. Klein and her daughter's meal today is on me. Whatever they want. The best wine, dessert, everything. Mr. Morrison, that's too much, Margaret protested. It's not nearly enough. Morrison gathered his laptop and coat. Rachel, your mother is extraordinary. I hope you know that. He left before they could protest further, pausing only to speak quietly to the manager, who nodded seriously. As Morrison walked out into the afternoon sunlight, he pulled out his phone and looked at the video one more time. Then he opened his email and sent it to himself with 3 copies marked keep. Some things were too important to risk losing. Inside, Rachel sat down across from her mother, reaching for her hands. Mom, what happened? Tell me everything. Margaret did, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. And when she got to the part about Morrison defending her, about the dress being vintage and valuable, Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have been here on time. I should have. You're here now. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hands. That's what matters. Rachel looked at her mother, really looked, and saw not the outdated clothes or the old-fashioned ways, but the woman who'd worked herself to exhaustion to give her every opportunity, who still took the bus across town just to see her, who'd maintained a 30-year-old dress with such care that a stranger recognized its value. I love you, Rachel said, and I'm sorry if I've ever made you feel like you needed to be anything other than exactly who you are. Margaret's smile could have lit the whole room. Order whatever you want, sweetheart. Today, we celebrate. They ordered the expensive salads and the good wine and dessert they'd share. They talked about Rachel's work and Margaret's garden and the years between visits that had grown too long. And when other diners glanced over, they saw not a woman out of place in an old dress, but a mother and daughter finding their way back to each other. Later, when Margaret got home to her small apartment, she hung the floral dress carefully in her closet. Tomorrow she might go back to her usual routine, coupons and reused foil and practical choices. But tonight, she'd been defended, valued, seen not as less than, but as worthy of protection and respect. She placed Morrison's card on her refrigerator, held by a magnet Rachel had sent from California. Not because she'd ever use it, probably, but because it was a reminder that kindness still existed, that some people still stood up for strangers. That dignity wasn't measured in dollars or designer labels, but in how you treated people when nobody was watching or when everyone was. And that sometimes, when the world tried to make you small, someone would step forward and remind you, you deserve to take up space. You deserve to be here. You deserve to be loved exactly as you are.